Hello, everybody. It is Easter Sunday, so happy Easter, everybody out there. In light of the fact that it's Easter and Christians are celebrating this event worldwide, I thought it would be good just to spend a few moments with you and talk about the resurrection, specifically why it is that Christians believe that Jesus rose again from the dead. Because when you think about it, this really is a crazy belief. We believe that there was a man who died and then he came back to life again. And this is contrary to everything that we experience. We know that dead people stay dead. So why do we believe something different when it comes to Jesus? Now, most people think that when it comes to the resurrection, you just have to believe it or you reject it. If you're going to believe it, it's just blind faith. You just accept it as a matter of your religious tenets and you move on with life. But in fact, there are good historical reasons to believe that Jesus rose again from the dead. Now, history cannot prove the resurrection, and historians cannot demonstrate a miracle per se, but what historians can do is demonstrate certain historical facts for which the best explanation of those historical facts is a miracle, in this case, the miracle of the resurrection. Now, if you're going to try to prove a resurrection, it's actually quite simple. You only need two things. Number one, you need to prove that the person actually died. You can't have a resurrection if they never died. And number two, you have to prove that after their death, they were alive once again. That's really all there is to it. Pretty simple way of proving the resurrection. Now, here's where the historical facts come into play, because we can ascertain certain historical facts about the life of Jesus that will demonstrate both of these steps. So step number one, Jesus had to die. Virtually all New Testament historians, and this isn't just believing scholars who are believers in Jesus, this is skeptics, this is atheists, agnostics, all New Testament historians agree that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and therefore he most certainly died. Roman executioners were responsible for crucifying the guilty, the condemned. And they made sure that the condemned did die. Crucifixion was very effective in killing people. It was 100% effective. Nobody survived crucifixion. And in the case of Jesus, because he died so quickly, just to make sure that he was dead before they took him off the cross, they thrust a spear in his side. So there's no question, medically speaking, that Jesus would have been in a dead state when his body was removed from the cross and he was put into the tomb. So this doesn't leave any room for conspiracy theories of people who would say that Jesus, feigned death and he was revived inside the tomb and he presented himself as being alive and it was all just a hoax. So the first step in proving the resurrection is quite simple. Crucifixion guaranteed that Jesus did truly die. What about the second step? That Jesus was alive after he had died. Well, there are two historical facts that I would like to point out in support of this particular premise. Number one is the empty tomb. That Jesus' body was no longer in the tomb in which it was buried. Now, this in itself does not demonstrate the resurrection, but it at least is a necessary condition, because you can't have a resurrection and yet the body still be in the tomb. Now, the reason historians believe that Jesus' tomb was empty is a couple of reasons. Number one, the Gospels report that the tomb was discovered empty by his women followers. Now, in that culture, they did not view women as equal to men. They were viewed as inferior. The testimony of women was not accepted on the same level as a man's testimony was accepted. So the fact that the gospel authors report that it was women who were the principal discoverers of the empty tomb lends credibility to that story. And so for this reason, virtually all New Testament scholars agree that the tomb was indeed found empty. Because if the disciples were inventing the story, surely they would have had male disciples as the chief discoverers. Secondly, when you think about where Christianity started, it started in Jerusalem. That's where Jesus was buried, was in Jerusalem. If the disciples are proclaiming 3 days after Jesus' death and burial that he had been resurrected, all you'd have to do to disprove that claim, if you are part of the Jewish leadership and want to squash this idea, is go to the tomb and produce the body. because a dead body in the tomb means there was no resurrection. And yet that didn't happen. The Jews couldn't produce a body. The body was indeed missing. In fact, they agreed that the body was missing. Matthew tells us that the Jews had a response to the Christians' claim of resurrection. They would point out that the tomb was empty, and the Jews' response was not, no, it's not empty. The body was there. Their response was, the disciples stole the body of Jesus. So even the enemies of Christianity agreed that the tomb was empty. But they could have, at least in principle, produced the body and thereby falsified the claim. So therefore, we know that the tomb was indeed empty. Now you might say, well, maybe the Jewish leadership was right. Maybe it was empty because the disciples stole the body. What would their motive be? Why would the disciples steal the body of Jesus? And of course, how would they get past the guards to do so? But aside from that practical issue, what motivation would they have? They did not understand Jesus' predictions that he was going to rise again from the dead, and Jewish theology was not expecting the resurrection of a single man prior to the end of time, so there was no expectation on their part. So you can't say that they were trying to fulfill some sort of prophecy or wanted to make Jesus' predictions come true or make people think that they came true, because they themselves did not understand that. So they had no motive for it. And proclaiming that Jesus rose again from the dead only got them ostracization, it got them persecution, it didn't do anything for them, it didn't get them wealthy, they didn't get women from it, and their religion prohibited them from doing so, so they had no motivation to steal the body. And if they did steal the body and proclaim that Jesus was alive from the dead, then that would mean that they were liars. They lied about this whole thing. But this is inconsistent with their character from what we know about them in the Gospels. And it's inconsistent with the fact that they gave their lives in proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the grave. You say, well, lots of people die for what they believe. Well, yes, but when they die for what they believe it's actually true. The kamikaze pilots believed in the cause of the Japanese when they would kill themselves. Muslim suicide bombers, they believe that Islam is true. They believe that they're going to die and go to paradise and have 70 virgins. But if the disciples made this stuff up, if they knew that Jesus' body was still dead and he had not been raised from the dead, and they stole the body to perpetrate this whole hoax, then they knew it was a lie. And people don't die for a lie. Liars don't make good martyrs. So the people may be willing to die for what they believe is true, but people are not generally willing to die for what they know is false. And the historical record shows that at least 5 and perhaps up to 11 of the apostles did die for their faith, for their confession that Jesus had risen from the dead. All right, so that's the first fact in support of the fact that Jesus was alive after his death. What's the second historical fact in support of this? Well, that would be the appearances of Jesus. Again, most New Testament historians agree that the disciples of Jesus had experiences of Jesus after his death that at least they understood to be appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, not all of these scholars believe that it actually was the risen Jesus. Many of them, as I said, are atheists, so they do not accept the resurrection explanation, but they do at least believe that it's historically accurate that these disciples had these experiences. And when you look at the nature of these experiences, Jesus didn't just appear one time. He appeared multiple times over a period of 40 days. He didn't just appear to individuals, like one at a time, but he appeared to groups of people. He appeared to the 12 apostles. He appeared to more than 500 brethren at once, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15. So there was multiple appearances to individuals, to groups of people. There were appearances in different locations, under different circumstances. Jesus didn't just appear to his disciples, but he also appeared to skeptics like his brother James, who did not believe on him prior to the resurrection. There was appearances to enemies like Paul, and those appearances convinced those men that Jesus indeed had risen from the dead. Now you might say, well, people have sightings of Elvis too, so what does that really matter? But when you think of the Elvis sightings, Elvis sightings are somebody looks in a photograph and there's some fuzzy man in the background that they interpret to be Elvis. It kind of looks like Elvis. Or they're walking down the street and somebody turns the corner and, oh, that looked like Elvis. That's very different from what we see in the Gospels. The appearances of Jesus in the Gospels, he was tangible. They touched him. They had prolonged conversations with him. They ate with him. So it's a very different nature than Elvis sightings. You can't chalk the appearances of Jesus to something like Elvis sightings. So when you have the historical facts of the empty tomb, when you have the historical facts of the appearances of Jesus, his crucifixion, therefore causing his death, you have to explain the evidence. What can best account for the historical facts? Now, there are plenty of non-miraculous explanations that have been given, and all of these pretty much have been abandoned by most scholars. Some people will say, well, the disciples were just wishful thinking. As I said, that can't be the explanation because they had no expectation of seeing Jesus. They didn't believe he was going to be resurrected. They just didn't understand it. And even when the women disciples, who were the first to have Jesus appear to them, when they told the apostles what they saw, they didn't believe them. So there was an attitude of disbelief. There was no attitude of expectation. Probably the most popular hypothesis that does not involve a miracle to explain these historical facts is that the apostles hallucinated. But the problem with this is twofold. Number one, it can't explain all the historical facts, namely the empty tomb, because if they were experiencing a hallucination of Jesus or some sort of vision of Jesus, then his body still would have been in the tomb. And yet it's a historical fact that the tomb was found empty. So that's the first mark against the hallucination theory. Second one is the nature of hallucinations are such that they are individual occurrences. You can't have more than one person experiencing the same hallucination at the same time, kind of like a dream. You can't lay down at night with your spouse and you're both going to dream the exact same thing. It doesn't work that way. Same thing with hallucinations. Only one person can have the hallucination. So it's not possible, since Jesus appeared to groups, that the entire group was experiencing the exact same hallucination. So this theory cannot explain all of the historical facts. What does explain it then? Well, I would argue the best explanation of the historical facts is the explanation that the first apostles and disciples of Jesus offered, namely that God raised him from the dead. That's the best explanation. You can come up with other explanations that don't explain all the facts, that don't involve a miracle, but the only explanation that explains everything is the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus. And when you find a group of people that are credible, that have nothing to gain by proclaiming that they saw him alive after he was dead, and they had everything to lose and indeed gave their lives for that claim, then we have good reason to believe that their explanation is the correct explanation. Now, this here is just a shortened version of some of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. If you want to explore some of the other evidence and go into a little more detail, you can go to my blog, which is Theosophical Ruminations, Theosophical, Theosophical Ruminations. Just Google it. And on my blog, there is an article, just do a search. It's called The Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus, a Short Case, where I go into a lot more detail and even link to other articles related to the resurrection, including one that goes into a lot of detail if you really want to do a lot of study. But I think this is a great exercise for Christians as well as non-Christians to see the foundation of our faith is not shaky. This is not some blind faith that we hold to, just choosing to believe that Jesus rose again from the dead. We may have experienced the risen Jesus, and we know he's alive because we've experienced him, but we also are on good historical footing to claim that he rose again from the dead. So your faith is built on more than wishful thinking. Your faith is solid. There is a God in heaven who raised a man named Jesus, and he is now the Lord and Savior. He is the resurrection and the life. And we can put our trust in him that one day we will experience what he experienced. So God bless you on this Easter. I hope you had a wonderful Easter holiday. And I do hope you'll check out the articles and research this matter further.